Dear followers of the Wereldmorgen, that's the world tomorrow. The news site that tries to bring the other news of things going on, social struggle here and abroad. Today we talked to Brian Mier for the second time. 4 months ago we talked about, the failed coup, attempted coup, but now the occasion is quite different. The visit of President Lula to China. No, actually, this visit here in our media was hardly reported at all. And if it was in a very demeaning, sideways, there was a big article in our main newspaper on the IMF being paralyzed by so much antagonism from all these countries after all the good it has been doing since the 70s and, in difficult circumstances, but always with a happy end. It really says always with a happy end. That's the way that this newspaper writes about IMF and on the side remark on Lula's visit to China. Anyway, Brian, Lula went to China, and it was already amazing that it went so fast after the first dates were set because he was ill. That's already tells you something. But basically what I would like you to bring us up to speed, what business deals in general terms and how important that is for the relation Brazil, China, etc. Also the effects it has on the de-dollarisation, if that's a term I can use. And then also the importance of Dilma Rousseff at the BRICS-bank there. And also maybe, if possible, something on the remarks that Lula made on Ukraine. So basically, Brian, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be back talking to you. When he first took office in 2003, the United States was Brazil's largest and most important trading partner. That scenario changed in 2009 when China passed up the US for the first time. In 2022, China bought 3 times more exports from Brazil than the United States. China's trade with Brazil is now dwarfing the US's trade with Brazil. The US is a distant second in terms of importance commercially for Brazil. So this was a very important visit for Lula, and the importance with which he gave the visit is shown by the fact that unlike his kind of symbolic visit with Joe Biden shortly after being inaugurated as president, this time he brought 40 government officials and 240 business leaders with him. And in one day, they signed, the day after he got there, the first day he became the first president or prime minister of a country to ever visit the BRICS-bank. He went for Dilma Rousseff's inauguration, and the second day he went to Beijing. He had this royal, not royal, but this massive red carpet treatment there. He was welcomed by a band playing one of the most historic anti-dictatorship songs of resistance, Novo Tempo, New Era by Ivan Lins, which was launched around the same time that the Workers' Party was launched in 1980. And in one meeting, he and Xi Jinping signed 15 bilateral agreements. And these agreements range from cooperation between the 2 central banks, abandoning the dollar in trade between the 2 nations, or building mechanisms for this that should be rolled out in July to make all of their transactions without the dollar. Scientific and technological cooperation and technology transfer, student exchange, mainly for math and science university students. A Chinese car company is going to take over the abandoned Ford automotive plants. Ford shut down shop in 2021 after 100 years in Brazil and left 5 big modern factories just empty. So the Chinese company is going to use them to make electric cars, and many other different arrangements and agreements. And apparently there have been another 6 that have happened since he's returned just in the last couple of days. Of these, I think it was really important that this idea of de-dollarization, It's really important. It's as Lula pointed out, who decided that the dollar was the new gold standard? You know, why does everyone have to use the dollar? Why can't we use our own currencies? And they're already moving forwards, Brazil, with a plan to de-dollarize all transactions with its third biggest trade partner, which is Argentina. But in that case, they have to develop these mechanisms. China already has a banking mechanism for doing this. In fact, China made its first transaction in Brazil with yuan the day that Lula was in China already. They're officially rolling it out in July, but it's already happening. And another important thing that happened, obviously, was Lula's appointing of former President Dilma Rousseff to president of the BRICS-bank. Now, this is important on a lot of different levels. And I know a lot of people in Brazil who were actually broke down in tears when they saw Lula hugging Dilma as president of the BRICS-bank, because it's a sign of political redemption. It's a very strong sign of redemption for the Workers' Party. Both Dilma and Lula have been totally exonerated from any kind of corruption allegations. In the case of Dilma, it was absolutely ridiculous. You know, she was removed from office over a non-impeachable budgetary infraction involving no personal enrichment that was widely practiced by every president who came before her, by all the governors and all of them, almost all of the mayors in Brazil. And it was legalized by the Senate 2 days after she left office. Bolsonaro did it during his entire presidency. And besides that point, she was exonerated from it. She didn't even do it. She was really the first president since the return from the dictatorship who didn't engage in fiscal peddling, which just represents like transferring money from one ministry to another before doing the annual budgetary report to cover, a loss or something, or a gap in the budget. So, and then in Lula's case, obviously, not only have all of his charges been annulled from the Operation Car Wash, but the judge who was working closely with the U.S. Department of Justice, Sergio Moro, who became Bolsonaro's justice minister immediately after helping jail Lula, he's now on trial for a bunch of different crimes. Most recently, yesterday, they announced that he's going to be tried in the Supreme Court for defaming a Supreme Court justice, falsely claiming without presenting any evidence that he was selling innocent sentences or something. And that carries a penalty of up to 4 years in prison and removal from the Senate. So on the political level, it was interesting, but also it's viewed by the Chinese government as a sign of a strong commitment on Brazil's part to the BRICS and to the BRICS-bank process. We know that the BRICS-bank was founded as an alternative to the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank and the IMF that have traditionally deeply exacerbated poverty in the global South by always conditionalizing their loans on a series of factors ranging from all purchases and services in the projects that the money's lent out for, coming from US companies like Bechtel or Halliburton or whatever, but also these neoliberal structural adjustments. For example, in the case of Mozambique, after the war, when the IMF put Mozambique under what it calls surveillance, it blocked the government from rebuilding any of the hundreds of hospitals and schools that were destroyed by Renamo guerrilla forces during the war. And pinning this to like, you have to show us that you're fiscally responsible before we'll allow you to rebuild any of this. And its management of the Mozambican economy transformed Mozambique into the poorest country in the world within 5 years. You know, just one tiny example. They've lent money out to dictators all over the global South, and then spent the years afterwards blaming the populations for fiscal irresponsibility, you know, based in part by loans, especially the World Bank, to these mega projects like hydroelectric dams that were never built, even in many cases. In the case of Brazil, there's at least a dozen World Bank or Inter-American Bank or IMF-funded mega projects that were never completed during the dictatorship years. And so the idea of this, the initial founding idea, was kind of not only sort of put on the back burner, but also the bank hasn't lent out that much money yet. It was founded in 2016. From what I understand, it's only lent out about $5 billion. And of this, 29% was in non-dollar currencies. So the expectation is that with Dilma in charge, they're going to increase the ratio of local currencies used in these loans. The loans are going to continue to go out without neoliberal structural adjustment conditionalities, which is basically will just destroy the influence of the IMF, as the Chinese government already is in the global south, by it loaning money out for these kinds of projects, airports, roads, whatever, ports, without conditionality requirements.
So actually, it's not just that the BRICS-bank is going to replace IMF in a lot of places, but the fact itself that BRICS is this other opportunity that countries have will force, is that what you're saying, will force the IMF to adjust and the World Bank to adjust, or will they just persist in trying to force their own will? How do you see that from Brazil?
I feel like they're going to have to adjust. I mean, I spent some years in the NGO field at ActionAid for a while, and I actually have met people inside of the World Bank who are very critical of its lending practices too. They're going to have to adjust. There's a lot of geopolitical reasons why the United States and its allies were unhappy with the Workers' Party years, but one of them is that the Brazilian National Social and Development Bank, BNDES, had a larger portfolio in the 2000s than the World Bank. It actually had more, it itself was larger than the World Bank. And it lent money out for the Caracas metro system, for a new line on the Caracas metro. It lent money out for construction of a port in Cuba, and for other projects in countries that the United States considers an enemy. So I think that taking all these factors into consideration, not just the BRICS-bank, but the way that China's lending out its money in Africa, for example, a stronger BNDES, and other BRICS countries doing similar things, it's going to force the World Bank to redo the way it does business, and the IMF as well, taking into consideration too that the position of Lula and the Workers' Party on these multilateral institutions is not that they should be eradicated, it's that they should be reformed. This is why Lula started lending money to the IMF in the 2000s so that Brazil could have votes inside of the IMF system as a shareholder nation. He believes that there should be equity among all the nations in the world within these institutions so that they're not dominated by the United States and Western Europe, which is the current case. One of the key tenets of the Workers' Party, it was founded by a bunch of former armed Marxist guerrillas and all kinds of other people too, intellectuals, labor unions, but the former armed resistance fighters who helped found the Workers' Party knew that model was a failure. Dilma Rousseff herself comes out of the armed resistance. It was a failure. So ideologically, the strategy of the Workers' Party has always been to push for Gramscian, building Gramscian spaces of counter-hegemony within existing institutions. So Lula's not, the Lula government is not trying to destroy the IMF or the World Bank or something like that. What they hope that this kind of thing influences these institutions to lend money out more fairly.
So that what you're saying is this step that has been taken by this trip to China is actually just a step in a process that was already ongoing for a long time. The question that I do ask myself, I know the history of Latin America from the 50s to 70s. How is the US, and when I say the US, the government, not precisely the people, but the US, going to react according to you in the coming years on this evolution?
In relation to Brazil, I'm a little bit worried, you know, living here for the last 30 years almost. I'm a little bit worried because even though there's all of this, you know, talk about new multipolar world, and it's clear that the economic center of the earth is shifting eastward, and the geopolitical center is shifting eastward. But the United States and Western Europe are still very powerful. And the US has its tentacles in Brazil. For example, last night, someone in the White House announced that the US was really offended by some of the things Lula has said about the conflict in the Ukraine. And this entered Brazil's media before it appeared in Reuters and AP and everything. Like, they'd already had the information. This was headline stories, global, whose television network was started by Time Corporation during the beginning years of the dictatorship. It has always very, very close relationship to US elites. Global ran multiple stories about this, about how angry the US is. It was a guy named John Kirby from inside the White House who said, Brazil has substantively and rhetorically approached this issue by suggesting that the United States and Europe are somehow not interested in peace. And the irony and the arrogance of a statement like that, coming from a country that has dropped an average of 46 bombs a day for the last 20 years, you know, saying, how dare they suggest that we're not interested in peace? It's ridiculous. But you know what? It was treated as such a big issue in the Brazilian media that's connected to the US. But for example, the story didn't even make the New York Times. The New York Times has been treating the issue of Lula's comments about Ukraine neutrally. You know, it's been explaining, well, you know, you have to keep in mind Brazil buys a quarter of its fertilizer from Russia. And, you know, Brazil's a major agro giant or whatever. So in a way, you got to wonder if the New York Times and the US big media starts repeating what Lula's saying about Ukraine, they're worried that it might convince more people in the US. You know, it's kind of like a news stories that they made for Latin America that they're not reporting on very strongly inside the US, because I think, as in Western Europe, I think support for this initiative in Ukraine is rapidly diminishing in the United States.
Well, I can tell you from the European, French, Dutch, German, and even some British, that the visit and the statements of Lula on Ukraine, if I summarize two things, idealistic, naive, and very, how would I say, demeaning towards the real peace seekers here in Europe, etc. So and on the real issue, what he really is saying, of course, you're not getting informed, but that I don't think that hardly surprises you. Anyway, what I can learn from your overview of the situation is that indeed important steps have been taken that are going in the right direction, but we are not there yet, and a lot of struggle has to be continued in the years ahead. Is there anything you want to tell us to summarize or to finalize?
Just on this naive take, we saw The Economist is accusing the Brazilian government of being naive. That's just social Darwinism. You know, remember, Herbert Spencer was an editor at The Economist. Global South nations are children to them. They're just naive children. Even though Celso Amorim, you know, the top foreign policy advisor to Lula, was called the greatest diplomat in the world in Foreign Policy magazine in 2009, then he's got over 40 years experience in diplomacy. Somehow, you know, he's naive. Whereas this 26-year-old journalist making a little bit over minimum wage in some copy room in The Economist knows what's really going on.
Yeah, and it's similar to the article I just showed you. That well, basically what it says is, what's wrong with these people that they do see the IMF not as a force for good? Well, actually, that is what we're up against. Brian,
Yes.
I want to thank you again for this overview of what's going on in the rest of the world. And I also thank you, followers of the Wereldmorgen. Don't forget, we offer this alternative, or whatever you call it, news for free, but you're always invited to support us financially. Thank you very much.
Thank you.